Amid calls for either his resignation or removal, Ghana's Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta presented the 2023 budget proposal to members of Ghana's parliament on Thursday. The proposal was anchored on a 7-point agenda, which the minister said was aimed at restoring macroeconomic stability and accelerating the economic transformation as articulated in the post-COVID-19 program for economic growth of Ghana. The 2023 budget's total expenditure, including clearance of arrears, amounted to 205.4 million Ghana cedis, about 25.6% of its gross domestic product. Now, while the controversial e-levy will be reduced, the budget does contain a proposal for an increase in VAT. And this budget comes at a time where Ghana's cedi has been rated the worst performing currency in the world after massive depreciation against the dollar, as well as Ghana having to go back to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. Joining me is Emmanuel Amoah-Darkwah. He's an economist and partner at C-KADD Global. Emmanuel, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
So it's difficult to ignore the fact that the minister presented this budget while there are conversations about the president either firing him or he himself stepping down. So let's sort of set the tone from that. And he can't be separated from the Nana Akufo administration. He's an extension of that administration. So has the administration been successful in handling Ghana's present economic challenges before we dig deeper into the budget?
Sure. Very good morning to our viewers. This is a very difficult time for the finance minister and also for the government itself. Already this week, the ad hoc committee that has been set up by the Speaker of Parliament had to investigate as to the charges brought against the minister, whether these are charges that will warrant for him to be moved or be relieved of his position. And so these are very difficult times. But in terms of solving the challenges, these are challenges that are going to take us between 2 to 3 years to resolve. These are not short-term challenges, but these are medium to long-term challenges that need a lot of structural policies to resolve going into the future.
So interestingly enough, he did announce that governments will extend the 30% cut in salaries for the president, the vice president, ministers like himself, deputy ministers, and others as well. And we know that this is something many governments across the continent have struggled to do. But I think the question many Ghanaians and even Africans would ask is, does this really have an impact? Is it a real impactful decision that the government has taken on this salary, or is it more of a ceremonial? We're cutting salaries so that we can show that we too feel the pain or we're ready to sacrifice for our people?
Yeah, the policy intention is commendable, I must say, but a critical look at the numbers, that is where we'll be able to see whether it is ceremonial or this is really going to have an impact. So permit me to quote some statistics here. According to the 2023 budget, before that, even the 2022 budget earmarked that we are going to spend about 35 billion Ghana cedis on compensation to government workers. This was reviewed to 37 billion Ghana cedis. But if you look at the 3 quarters as we have it now, per the available data, we have spent about 27 billion 947 as against a provisional target of 27 billion 146, which means that we're only making a savings of around 800 million. So it is not that, it is even less than a billion. So it is not that huge sacrifice to make in this crucial time. There have been a lot of calls for government to reduce the government's size in its entirety, but the government has not heeded to the core yet. But a critical look at the numbers, it means that we are not saving that much as that is being postulated by government.
All right, so let's go deeper into what this budget offers. So the minister has said that the budget is anchored on the administration's 7-point agenda. And some of the pillars of that agenda include aggressively mobilizing domestic revenue, streamlining and rationalizing expenditures, like the question you just answered now, boosting local productive capacity. When you look at all of these things and you look at the budget that was presented yesterday, are these the things that Ghana needs to focus on to restore macroeconomic capacity and stability?
Yeah, definitely. This is a restoration budget. If you look at the title of the budget, restoring and sustaining macroeconomic stability and resilience through inclusive growth and value addition. For me, it is very commendable that government earmarked about 110,000 hectares of farmlands, which is supposed to go into the production of the very things that we import. According to the minister, we have about the various things that we import into the country. We have about 45% of them that can be produced locally, i.e., rice, poultry, cooking oil, and all the very stuff that I have mentioned. So I think on that front, we have to boost the local capacity to produce the very things that we have comparative advantage of. I look forward to the details of such a program, but it has to be a value chain analysis from the research that goes into what kind of seeds you are even planting to the last step of getting the various commodities to the consumer. So I look forward to the details of that program, but I think the policy intention is very good for us to look at local manufacturing of the things that we can produce. On the other hand, I think the increment of VAT by 2.5% in an inflationary period is not that good. Because this is a consumption tax. As I speak to you now, consumer price inflation is 40.4%. Producer price is around 65.2%, which means that once you increase VAT, it is going to be a pass-through. There's going to be a pass-through effect on the final consumer. If you look at the standard invoice in Ghana, originally you are paying VAT of 12.5%. You have 2.5% for GET fund. That is Ghana Education Trust Fund. You have another 2.5 on NHIL, and then you have another 1% on COVID levy. And so when they are increasing it by 2.5%, it means that a typical invoice in Ghana now, you're going to have a 21% tax slapped on it. And in an inflationary period like this is not a policy that you should be able to implement, in as much as you want to, widen the tax net.
Yes, and you're actually taking me to my next question because, as you said, value-added tax will move from 12.5 to 15%, and the controversial e-levy is getting yet another sort of transformation. So that's going to go from 1.5% to 1%, with that 100 Ghana cedis daily threshold to be removed. So there is the need, we've seen that African governments have, to widen the tax net, but the timing seems to be the issue many people have. Is this really the time where we should be seeing an increase in taxes for people that will go across board versus what government can do to increase revenue elsewhere or decrease their burden elsewhere as well?
I think there's not a time for us to increase taxes. For me, my argument has been on compliance. We have existing tax regimes that once we are compliant by the existing tax regimes, we will be able to rake in a lot of revenue. About 2 months ago, the Ghana Revenue Authority deployed its staff to the various big shopping malls and also to the other retail centers. And it is clear that there is a lot of abuse in the system. So for me, we should widen the tax net. We have to start from compliance, whereby we'll be able to comply to the latter, the existing tax regimes. The bigger conversation will be the law of people. Ghana is a largely informal, has a largely informal sector. So how do you get these people to contribute their quota? For example, if a mason or a carpenter earns about 500 cedis in a day, how much of that is paid as tax? And that is not what we've been able to do as a country. And going forward, these are things, it's very difficult to do, but we have to start from somewhere, either than just slapping consumption tax, because it is easy to do. Once you slap a VAT, everyone who buys a product or provides a service is going to attract that 15% VAT. But the bigger conversation should be, how do we get the largely informal sector to contribute their quota to the taxes? Already, tax to GDP ratio is around 12%, below regional average and other lower middle income countries. We have to increase it. But if you have to increase it, what are the measures that you are implementing to be able to get to 18% or 20% in the medium term?
Okay, so Emmanuel, let's also look at this, and we have to have this debt conversation. So the minister, Ofori-Atta, noted that the current debt sustainability analysis that has been done reveals that Ghana is now considered to be at high risk of debt distress, and that the depreciation of the cedi has seriously affected Ghana's ability to manage its public debt, which has now gone to $48.9 billion this year. So the country has agreed a debt management strategy with the International Monetary Fund, and he didn't really expand on what the details of that strategy would look like. So if you had to guess, what do you think the strategy would actually look like? What should we be anticipating as we then move on to the conversation with the IMF as well?
Yeah, it is obvious that there's going to be debt restructuring. But in doing a debt restructuring, there are three options. It's either you touch the principal, the interest, or the tenor of the loan. And the president has already assured that there's not going to be touch on the principal. But his minister also backtracked by saying that there will be some level of haircut. But we are yet to know the details. And I must say that in this domestic debt restructuring, it shouldn't always focus on the domestic sector, but it's also we should focus on the external side as well. There are other components of external debt that we can restructure, like bilateral loans. We can, negotiate with these creditors to either grant us a relief in some of the interest that we are paying, or even elongate the tenor of these loans. So I believe that the details are yet to be out, but I will propose that it should cut across not only the domestic but also the external, and government should show commitment of how much they can also contribute in this whole domestic debt restructuring procedure.
It'll be interesting because we are hearing that Ghana will ask holders of its international bonds to accept losses of as much as 30% on the principal, and also forgo some interest payments. So it's going to be interesting to see how Ghana can pull this off. But in talking about the debt restructuring, that leads us, of course, to the IMF conversation. So we see that the negotiations are ongoing. The minister said that they should be wrapped up very soon, and that there has been agreement on preliminary fiscal adjustments, debt strategy, and financing required. A lot of people are worried about the potential for austerity measures, but the president keeps saying it's not going to be bad. There should not be any austerity measures. In terms of this $3 billion loan that seems to be coming Ghana's way, how should it be utilized?
We are yet to reach a deal, and we don't know how much we are going to get from the fund. But should we even get the 3 billion, it is not going to come as a lump sum 3 billion. Per IMF programs, what they do is that it is disbursed in tranches, and these tranches are linked to what we call performance criteria. So based on a certain criteria the IMF will set for you over a period of time, once you're able to meet the criteria, then they disburse. But for starters, it is going to boost balance of payments position, because we have depleting reserves, which is also culminating into the depreciation of our currency. And so for starters, it's going to push in our balance of payment position, so that we'll get some level of stability to gain access to the international capital market and also restore macroeconomic stability. But beyond an IMF program, the conversation will be how do we resolve our structural economic problems, i.e. low revenues, at the same time expenditure has been ballooning, budget deficit has been going high, and also public debt has been going high. As I speak to you now, Ghana's public debt is in excess of 464 billion Ghana cedis, as compared to GDP around 76% to GDP. Going beyond an IMF program, how do we resolve these structural problems? And I think this is what policy should be able to look at in addressing these structural problems. And I see a semblance of possibility of an IMF program. In this budget, government announced that there's going to be a freeze on public sector employment. And this is typical of IMF programs. If you look at the size of our compensation to government employees, then there should be a freeze on, government employees. So I already see a semblance of IMF proposals that have been inculcated into this 2023 budget.
All right, Emmanuel, before I let you go, let's look at a few more numbers. Now, Ghana's economic growth is expected to slow to 3.7% in 2022 from 6.7% in 2021 and probably move to 2.8% in 2023. Now, despite a projected increase in revenue, the minister said that the fiscal budget would increase, budget deficit that is, to 7.7% of GDP from 6.6% over the coming year. And Ghana's access to the international capital market has largely been closed and has become more urgent for the country to mobilize domestic revenue. So when you look at all the things that Ken Ofori-Atta presented yesterday with this draft proposal for the 2023 budget, do you think these are the measures that are going to help Ghana get through the next few months, the hard times ahead, and as you said, get back on the road in the next 2 to 3 years?
In the next 2 to 3 years, I expect, for example, property tax has been on the banner for a while now. The government in the 2022 budget hinted that they are going to start implementation in January 2022, but it never happened. And so looking at the rigidities in our budget, almost three budget items consumes all our revenue, i.e. interest payment, compensation to government employees, and statutory payments. Going forward, how do we raise a lot of revenue to free up the budgets to provide a lot of fiscal space for capital investment? And this is what is supposed to, government should be able to consider going into the medium term. But if you look at the flagship programs we currently run, I think it's about time government review some of them because of its burden on public finances, so that we'll be able to have efficiency in implementing these policies. Again, Ghana has a largely informal sector. How do you get the informal sector to pay taxes for us to embark on the needed expenditure for economic growth? And these are the things that policymakers this year and then going into medium term should consider for us to get out of the economic crisis we currently find ourselves in.
All right, Emmanuel, Amoah-Darkwah, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to keep an eye on what's happening in Ghana. Even now, the announcement of the crude for gold or gold for crude is a massive conversation that we'll also be touching base with. Thank you so much.
At some point, we will comment on that. We are yet to know the details of that particular. We are quite worried and we don't know the details of it. It's sort of a barter arrangement, gold for oil, but we are yet to know the details that will be fleshed out by government, whether it's going to help Ghana in this difficult moment now. All
right, Emmanuel, I'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
And looking at some of the highlights, if I can get those back on the screen, of the 2023 budget, there's an intentionality that one sees, but does that intentionality also meet the needs of Ghanaians and the Ghanaian economy at this time? So the budget will be raising the value-added tax by 2.5% to 15%. The e-levy, which has been a very controversial subject, is decreasing to 1%, but that particular aspect of the levy that was in place to help the vulnerable has been removed, and that's the threshold. There will be a freeze on new tax waivers for foreign companies. There's also going to be a review of tax exemptions for the free trade zone as well. A freeze on hiring of public and civil servants. Extension of a moratorium on government car purchases and non-essential travel. Even an extension of a 50% reduction on fuel allocation. So a number of things in this budget, tentatively seemingly like a good one, but of course implementation, and at the end of the day also making sure that whatever happens in conversations with the IMF doesn't push Ghanaians and Ghana too much closer to the edge. The minister admitting that the country is at high risk of default and distress in that presentation to Parliament. We'll be following closely to see what happens with West Africa's second largest economy and one of the largest cocoa producers on the continent and, of course, around the world.